Hola, hola. Welcome everybody to this week's Cafecito. We are having a great conversation today. I'm so excited for this episode. I'm so excited for my guest, Alejandra Mielke. Welcome, Alejandra.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for inviting me. Hello, everyone. I love having these conversations and these opportunities to talk to people and to bring this type of talks to inside the office, if we're in the office or if we're having lunch. So thank you for having me today.
Yay, yay. It's a pleasure. And I love today's conversation because when we were going back on the notes, how culture shapes leadership
Mhm.
style. And that's something, especially within United Latinas, we're always kind of conversating of just our nest, right? And leveling up our leadership skills. But this is truly the impact of how our culture, because I believe Latinas are the change makers and the solution drivers. So I'm so eager to hear your insight on how culture, and let's break down what culture is first
Yeah.
when we get into that and how that shapes who we are and how we
Ex-
show up.
Oh yes, definitely, because it's there. Definitely is there. And I think I didn't think about this until later in my career, right? First of all, I'm a foreign-born Latina, so I moved to this country um, later in life. I was almost 30 years old when I moved to this country, so I had a long time in my home country where I was able to develop a very strong connection to, of course, to my roots, to who I was as a Mexican individual, right? So when I moved here, I that's when I started realizing that there are differences, that people see the world in many different ways, that there are different ways to respond, to react, to interact with other people, and that all those different ways are based on culture. So then based off because of my studies and what I do, so I really I took a deep dive into understanding what culture is. So for me it's fascinating because culture is all this set of rules. Some of those are spoken, other ones are unspoken, that are generally invisible, but they are learned. We learn them, we absorb them when we are interacting with others, when we're living in a specific group, and they are familiar to all of us, right? We recognize them when people do something. Oh, yeah, that is part of what I do, is part of my culture, and they are accepted. So when culture is something that is familiar to all of us, I mean, to the specific group, is accepted as the right way to act, interact, react, right? It's learned and it's invisible. So all those things is what creates this concept of culture. And every group has a specific culture. We as Latinas have a culture, and then we have subcultures, like if we are from Mexico, if we are from other countries, and then we also have subcultures, right? We can go all the way down if we talk about the subculture of an organization, or the subculture of a specific field of study. So all of those are having those four elements, those ingrained, invisible, familiar, accepted ways of being and doing. So that's what culture is.
I love how you articulated that because I kind of it gives like a solid understanding to individuals. When we think about culture, sometimes we think of Latinidad, and that culture as a
Mhm.
whole. But I think I love how you broke it down that it there's multiple cultures. There's your upbringing, your actual
Mhm.
upbringing by your family itself, and then the history culture and baggage culture that is tied to that, depending on the country that you're from or where you grew up. So there's that thinking of how this is the way it should be. I remember growing up and it's like, for some reason, I felt like we were second class. And I'm sure a lot of Latinas, right? Like living in the US as a young girl, I'm like, wait, why are other people more important than us? I didn't get it, at that time. And not that that was said, right? Sometimes
It
it's
was
not
not said.
necessarily said.
Uh-huh.
It was never said. It was just something that we understood, like certain
Yeah.
things.
It's ingrained, right? I always say absorbed. I always also use the metaphor of like when you are gonna drink tea, right? And you have hot water and you put a tea bag, and then
Yep.
all that flavor goes into every single molecule of the water. So that is what culture is, right? It's inside our pores, inside who we are. It's absorbed by all of us, and it's very invisible, right? We cannot. Uh, Sometimes people think because we have different levels of culture. Sometimes people think about culture, things that we can see, what we talked about when we say fun, food, and flags, right? The music and the food and the clothes and the colors, right? That's one level of culture. It's superficial in the sense that we can see it. But
Yeah.
when we go deeper, then we think about those things that are very invisible in the way that we act, the way we do, the way we say hello, the way we approach people, the distance that we have between two people, right? All those things are way more invisible. But the interesting thing is that, and again, this is what I learned later. And once you start learning this and thinking about this, you if you develop that habit, you're gonna see it everywhere. Then you start thinking about, oh, everything I do, of course, is shaped by my culture. Everything I do is shaped by my culture. And that's when you start analyzing that, oh, okay, so my ways of doing, being, acting are shaped by my culture. And that means that other people's ways of doing, acting, and doing or reacting are shaped by their culture, right?
Yeah. I love that. So how does one recognize that within themselves? Right? Like you either can get to that point where you're self-aware and you're like, I'm doing this because it was something that I was taught and I probably don't believe that thing, right? But how
Yeah.
do how does someone get to that point?
I think the fastest way when that happens, when people have those reactions at first, is when you are put in contact with something that is different, right? So when you are faced with difference, you're like, oh, okay, this is different. Oh, and then sometimes it's a shock. That's why we talk about cultural shock. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, right? We all heard the phrase. So it's actually what it is, right? You have like two cultures and they're like, oops, they're clashing, they're crashing, right? So that's and that usually happens when we leave home to go to university. I'm sure some of us have experienced that, or we go to another country, or we go to a different company, or we go to a different city, so that we have that. And that is a perfect opportunity to start thinking about this, right? To start informing yourself, educating it, like, okay, what is this about culture? What is it about culture that I have to understand? Learning, understanding, and I mean, doing things like this, listen to these conversations, because you're like, okay, now I know that whenever I feel that that's the clash of values or the clash of cultural ways, that means that there's something about that. And I can continue to reflect uh, about that, continue to journal, right? And like, what am I feeling this? Continue to go back and talk to other people in your community, asking the questions. So, why do we think about that? Or what do you think is the most important thing in our family? Or what do you think is the most important thing as us as Mexicans of having those conversations? And I think it then becomes a habit of continually be asking, like, oh, why? Why am I doing this? Why am I doing that? Right? And try to find ways to connect it to who we are, culturally speaking. I think a lot of us do not go deep into our cultures. We take it for granted because it's part of us all the time. And sometimes we have to take those deep dives into learn about our history. It's important to have an idea like what happened to us, who we are, right? Sometimes we have to do that because it's not going to be taught in schools, or it's going to be tried to be erased, right? So we have to go deep down and say, like, who are we as a continent, right? If we're talking about Latinas, we go all the way from here all the way to Argentina and maybe in Spain. We want to think about that, but it's important to keep an eye open to those different understandings, and that requires some intentionality and effort. And because, like I said, if we don't do it, nobody else is going to do it for us. Nobody's going to come and have these conversations with us. So once we start understanding where we come from, I think it gives a lot of information about a lot of the things that what we do, right? Of the actions that we take and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I definitely want to dive into the leadership side, but like some of what you said reminded me of like when I went back and started reading the history of, Puerto Rico
Hmm.
and how all of that happened. And I'm sure for every, especially for Mexico, and I'm sure that there's a lot of anger that comes when you really discover the true history of what has happened to you. So how do we address that first before we can say, okay, let me be that best version of me? But how do I address how I feel about what has happened to my people, and how do we move past that? Let's start there.
I think I have two things. We have to
Okay.
respect our feelings and our emotions because
Hmm.
they're very valid and they tell a lot about who we are, right? If we feel the anger, if we feel the
Sadness,
the sadness,
hmm
when we understand some of the injustices and some of the colonialism that we have been part of, unfortunately, there's gonna be some resentment, some anger, and we have to validate that. There's a reason for that feeling.
Yeah.
We have to understand that feeling. We have to befriend that feeling. And that's another thing about coaching, all that, right? But we have to befriend because it's part of who we are. And it just tells us that we are caring human beings that are becoming more knowledgeable, and that feeling is okay to have. It's
Yeah.
okay to have. Might not be okay to stay in that anger and resentment for a long time, but it's okay to have. It's like welcome. It's like you welcome a kid. I mean, yeah, a kid who's crying. You welcome the kid. You're like, no, no, okay, everything's gonna be okay. So you take care of that anger like that. You like, I see you, I hear you, I understand you, and we're gonna have to pass this. We have to move on, right? But it is not gonna, and some people take longer than others, some people, right? So it's a very personal thing. But don't fight it, don't get upset with your
Yeah.
anger, don't minimize it, don't like feel it, because there's a place for it. And so that is respecting that anger, right? That was the first thing I want to say. And then the second thing is that another muscle that we have to develop a lot is our um, competency of being objective, right? To be like, okay, this happened. It's unfortunate. I'm going to see it as a accident of history, right? As something, right? And be like, okay, how am I gonna make sure that this does not happen again? What is gonna be my role to help prevent this from happening again, or to help people who are going through this, or what am I doing, right? And that becomes part of what you do. Doesn't mean that you have to become an activist. I mean, if you don't want to, but if you want to, right? Although you don't have to run for public office, but in everything we do, and people are always watching, in everything we do, we are minimal actions. You can try to disarm whatever happened, or try to present a different perspective, right? That's what we do here in United Latinas, and what I do with my work is like, no, I have to take up space. I have to be present so I can contrast, that's an English word, all the negative and deficit views that they have on the Latino community, or on other Mexicans. So I have to continually, and I might not be an activist, or like I said, a politician, but with my work, and I could be in any other kind of industry, I'm always trying to do that, right? So that's how we can do that.
I love that. Like when I researched like that our Taino background, and I learned
Mhm.
that they never fought with anything deadly. All of their weaponry was to disarm someone or to take someone down. And I think that taught me leadership in the sense of we don't have to, to how they handled their enemies. They weren't trying to hurt them or kill them. They were trying to maintain their civility in some way, but defend themselves. So now let's bring that into like how we can use some of the traits of our history and of our culture, of the many different ways of culture that you mentioned, to present ourselves or to be leaders in the world around us.
And I think that's an amazing point, Sandra. I think that when we can learn so much, right? But and again, it has to be intentional, and it has to be on us, because if not, nobody's
Yeah.
gonna do it, right?
Yeah.
But what we have done, and in my work that I do with El Puente Institute, what we have done is to bring this awareness to all of us, right? To understand, to make people aware of these cultural understandings that we have around the world, because they're going to impact what we do regarding our leadership performance. So is very clear. Like I said, once you start noticing, you're gonna start seeing that everything that we do is based, of course, in our culture, and we have to understand what are some of those things that work for us, and what are some of those cultural understandings that might not help us a lot. So let's talk about the first one, the ones how they work for us, right?
Yeah.
So at El Puente Institute, and we talk about cultural drivers, and we use the word drivers very carefully, because it's something that drives you in a way, right, in a direction towards doing something, right, or it stops you from moving. So that this idea of movement, of driving towards, of driving, no, right? So that's why we call them a cultural driver. So we talk about in the Latino community, we talk about um, certain, they are called cultural scripts. They are based on research. People have actually spent years researching this, which is amazes me. And we call them cultural drivers. But we talk about, for example, ideas like familismo, right? Familism, or ideas like respeto, respect, simpatía, being friendly, personalismo, having this, being very relational. So talking about ideas of Marianismo, how the specific role that women have in society, or what that is perceived for women in societies, and machismo, for example. So these are some of the cultural scripts that we talk about. So when we talk about that, we first give a very clear understanding, explanation of what they are, because we want them to be very understood. Because some of them can be very good for us, right? Like when we talk about personalismo, they can be a fantastic cultural script that we can use in our favor. We can develop great relationships. We get to know people. We can develop a genuine interactions with others. We can get to know other people more in depth. So that's something that can be really good for us. Or the one of respeto, for example, right? And let me tell you an example. I think I've said this before in other times, but when I moved here, one of the first instances when I noticed that, hey, something is weird, something's going on here, was when I came here to work on my PhD, right? So I was at UT Austin, and my advisor asked me to call her Joe instead of Dr. Worthy, by the way that I was calling her. And there was no way that I was gonna call her Joe. There was absolutely no way. I had this idea of, I had to be respectful to this person that had a PhD, that was my superior, that was my advisor, and I wasn't gonna call her Joe. In the meantime, right, Shauna next to me was calling Joe since day number one, right, with absolutely no care whatsoever.
Yeah.
And at some point I felt bad. I was like, oh, that is not oh, there's something wrong with me, right? I cannot make it in this country. I cannot be very this level of egalitarianism with supervisors. I cannot make it. I don't have what it takes. I remember thinking, I don't have what it takes. And of course I ended up calling her Joe later, right? A few months later, everything was fine. But later, when I understood my culture, when I understood that this is just respeto, it's the way that I've been raised, is what I have ingrained in me, doesn't mean anything else. Then you realize, okay, I'm gonna be okay when I can use this in my favor, right? That is gonna benefit, and when it's not going to. So I understood that, okay, I can use this to be very respectful. And of course, I didn't get into any fights, and believe me, there were fights. In any other workplace, there are always things, but I was always very thoughtful about that, and I always use that cultural script of respeto in ways that are going to be beneficial for me and for the projects that I was running. So there are examples of those examples like those in many other ways, right? But it's always important to be aware of the things that you have that you can bring to the table, like in this case respeto, personalismo, or all these things that can really create with you that sense of I have it, I have this power, I have this superpower that I can bring to the table.
Yeah. And I love that first one because that respeto is such a big thing within our communities because we believe everyone is, worthy of some level of respect. But in the US of A, like it's hard. That is a culture shock for many people. Like, wait, what do you mean? But I think it's that understanding of other people, you're just as valuable as that other person. So that respect, it should be both ways, right? So, and I love that example of, someone wanting to be called by their first name, or and we're like hesitant, like, no, I know you as Mr. or Doctor or this thing. But because I think we've all come across that, right? And then it's like, okay, no, I can call them by their first name. And that's a wonderful thing, not a negative thing, because my first name, as they call me, is just as worthy, it's just is at that same level of human respect, right? Because we have those values of,
Exactly, and we just have to use it, right? And also, I think one of the best things that we also have at Latinas, and I think um when we're talking about, so before I go there, I have to say something. When we think about who we are, the values that we bring, right? Like the ones I said, familismo, marianismo, respeto, personalismo, simpatía, all those things, and how we bring them right into the table, into the game, and we can use them to benefit ourselves and our projects, like I said. We also have to be very aware that sometimes our leadership performance is going to be impacted by this. For example, in this case, it was saying not be able to say the first name, whatever. But sometimes it goes deeper when it's time to, for example, to provide feedback. Sometimes because we are so close to our team members, we have developed strong relationships, or we respect people that much, all those things, that we have a hard time giving feedback that can be because we don't want to hurt feelings, or we don't want
yeah,
to hurt feelings, right? So we have to be
yeah,
aware of those things. Or when it's time to delegate, because we want to take care of everyone, because we want to be the good leaders, we don't delegate it, like, no, I can do it, I'll take it. So then we have a hard time delegating and passing work to other people. So sometimes those things can be very good for us, but sometimes can really hinder our efforts to really develop into strong leaders. So we have to be careful about that, or keeping people accountable. Sometimes because we are personalismo or familismo combined, they sometimes make us stay in these very close groups instead of going out, instead of trying new things or inviting new people here. So everything has some things that we have to be aware that might be beneficial, and other things that might not be that beneficial. So we have to understand and be aware and keep learning, and like, how is this going to help me, and how is this not going to help me? So we talk always about, but before that, you need to be aware, because when you can name it, whatever it is, right, you can either claim it as something that you can use as a superpower, or you can tame it and bring it down a little bit if it's not helping you. So we think about that. And the other important thing to keep in mind is that a lot of our ways, the Latino cultural values, is Latino cultural scripts, and we talked about it at the beginning, they clashed with US cultural values, or US or corporate America cultural values. While we are a familismo or collective culture, corporate US is more individualistic. So
yeah,
talking about a cultural shock, when we go into the office, when we have our cultural values, and in the office or in these workplaces, there's a different set of rules or different ways of doing things because they come from a different culture, that cultural clash can be strong, right? So the best thing is to keep in mind that we are very flexible. We have access. Once we learn, we have access to two systems, to these two cultures where we can make sense of the world. And I think it's fantastic that we have access to those two sets of cultures,
Yeah. I
right?
love that so much. I think we as a community are we have more empathy for one another. We have more regard for understanding
Mhm.
everybody's position in a space and bringing them to the table as everyone has that level of value. Coming into the U.S. Can be, it most certainly is, not can be, it most certainly is like, hold up, everybody cares just about themselves when we care about the collective. But how do we bring our culture into leadership spaces and become the leaders that are at that level and present in that same way? And I don't know if I said that correctly, because there's a whole bunch of thoughts behind that as I say it. But I think what we, how do we become better leaders and navigating the waters in this country?
I think if I could summarize like in three points. I'm gonna try to put it like 3 points, right? How do we do it? I think number one is and we talk about it today in this half hour, awareness, right? Nothing can happen without awareness. You have to
Yeah.
learn about your history, you have to learn about your culture, you have to learn about why you do things the way you are, right? So it's, I mean, the way you do. So that awareness is key. If the leaders, good leaders, right, are very self-aware and aware of other things besides them. They decenter themselves, right? They learn about things.
Hmm.
So that's number one, awareness. That's number one, awareness. And number, so if I would put two, I'm up three. So number two would be once you know and you learn about the other ways as well, right? So you have learned about both your ways, your Latinidad, like you said, and the way that other cultures see the world. You're aware of that, you're open also to understand different ways, and we have to move away from the judgment. None of these ways is better than the other. There's just different ways, right? People do things differently, so we have to think about that. It's not about one being better than the other, it's just different. So once you are aware and you have those two systems, you are familiar with those systems, then you are very proud of the things that make you, and you bring them to the table. Like as a Latina, I'm very proud of bringing my respeto. I use it, my personalismo, my familismo. I bring that warmth with me. I bring that genuine interest in other people. I bring that relational skill of understanding and asking questions. So I bring that very carefully. And I also, number three, I also know when I might have to adapt to the other ways. There are situations when you have to adapt, and you have to also take advantage of being bicultural and learn how to possibly do some things in different ways. So I think that for me is the key, the awareness, the proud of who you are, bringing it to you, and also the understanding that we are flexible and we can go from one situation to the other, finding that balance.
I love that. And I can't believe it's already been 30
I
minutes,
know.
because I feel like we just been talking for 5 minutes. But so how, I want to ask this as the last question. So how do we foster a workplace that really recognizes diversity, and that same thinking that you just mentioned, that we sometimes have to navigate and we have to be both cultures effectively? So how do we do that to the workplaces that we're in?
So that's what I said. It was about ourselves, right? What do we do for ourselves? And then when it's time for the workplaces, and that's what I also work very hard in creating places that are culturally competent, right? And it is to model, you have to model, right, what you do. But if you are a leader that has power on some decisions and actions in your workplace, so, and we all have certain power, we all have certain, whatever our position is, we all have some power. It's always a start, thinking about what is the disposition of the people around in the team to be more culturally competent. And the key word is disposition. What is disposition to really know about others, to learn about others? What is disposition? What is that willingness? Some people have it. Some other people's don't. So kind of a good measurement, like where are we in that, in this workplace? Also, what, and we have to be knowledgeable. We have to learn about other cultures. So all these efforts that are made by ERGs and organizations like El Puente and other, when we bring the knowledge to the organization, to both the Latinos and the non-Latinos, so you are aware of different cultural ways of being, right? So we have to learn. There's no other way. We have to learn, understand more, get connected with others, reach out others with respect. So you have to learn. And then you also have to be very mindful. Everyone has to develop some emotional intelligence, because when we are faced with difference, we always have a reaction like, oh, yeah, I don't like this. And and sometimes it's said worse than what I just said, right? So we have to bring the emotional intelligence, the mindfulness, to stop, to not react right away, right? To try to
Yeah.
understand. That's important. And then you have to change your actions. You have to edit. You have to audit your policies. You have to audit your processes, right? You have to audit and say like, who's speaking here? Who's not speaking? Who's been heard? Who's not been heard? But I think it's a combination of all those elements. But I think the most important would be like, how willing are we to learn about others? How willing? How can I develop that competency in my teams or in my organizations? That willingness to learn about others. That's important. I think that's key.
I love that. I love that. And I'll just end with this. How do we take that and become better leaders, right? Use those skill sets to really
Mm-hmm.
own our voice and own our power and be better leaders.
Yeah, exactly. I think we have to just think about those things, right? And I think that's why the training and the learning is so important, because this is knowledge that has to be, you have to be continually absorbing, right? Absorbing, like
Yeah.
learning continually, like once one and done is not going to be enough. So continually learning is like, okay, so if I know how important is that willingness, that disposition to learn about others, right? For my team and for me, for everyone, let me keep that in mind. Let me not forget that. And I'm continually making the effort to, okay, let me learn about others. So you can then do it yourself and learn about others, right? And then you can talk about this and teach others that they have to learn about others, right? I think it's very important, that continual learning. And when you want to be better leaders, I think that I'm giving this to the Latinas that are listening also, and I wish somebody had done it for me. So if you're a leader, you can do something like this, and you can also help other people take this, use this question. But I always think in this position, in this willing to learn about others, I always think about this question, about a question that I use a lot. What about your lived experience would be useful for me to learn or to know as we work together? What about your lived experience would be useful for me to know? Nobody asked me that question. I don't know if I ever asked you that question, Sandra. Nobody asked me that question. I don't have any of my
Yep.
managers reach out to me or something. Can you
Yep.
imagine? It would be
Yep.
out of this world. But it's an essential question, and if you even and we can use it with people that work with us,
Yeah.
and we can teach the question for other people to work. We could use it for everyone together, right? So imagine the possibilities with a question like that,
Mm.
of group, the conversations, the yeah, what can come out, and what clarity can we have when we talk about, when we relate and work with others, when we
Yeah,
use
I
that
love it.
question.
The understanding, where even
Understanding.
asking that question to someone that isn't in the same culture, it's that pondering, like, oh, I've never thought about it. That,
Exactly.
and
Because
that's
if
the
yeah,
difference.
if you notice, I said, what about your lived experience? I don't say about what about your
Correct.
culture?
Correct.
What
Yeah.
about your lived experience? Because it can be very different
Yeah. Yeah.
across even from the same culture.
Yep. Yep. Alejandra, I don't want to end this conversation because this is so great. I'm sure we're going to have more, but I appreciate you joining me for Cafecito. I
Of
want to give you a
course.
moment to give your last message and then tell us how people can connect with you on here.
Yeah, so I just want to, I mean, I think my last message is to keep learning, to keep looking forward, to keep uh saying yes, and always with this idea of with this growth mindset, right? Like always learning what's next, what am I observing. I think that's a very important habit. Observe patterns, see who's present, who's not present, right? That's my final message. And always as you look outside to observe and always learn, always keep always looking inside. Always go back to you, always understand more about who you are, develop your self-awareness. I think that would be my last message. And I'm in LinkedIn, Alejandra Rodriguez Mielke, that's Mielke. So I'm willing to talk to anyone. I'm very present in LinkedIn, so I'm there. Thank you,
I love
Sandra,
it.
for having me.
I love it. Thank you, Alejandra, for joining me. And join us next time for next week's Cafecito. And we will see you guys again. Take care, guys.
Excellent. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.